An imminent state of emergency in Ukraine as it braces for a full Russian invasion. Today, President Putin was on military parade in Moscow, while Ukraine's foreign minister made his case to the United Nations.
We are currently at the middle of the largest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. This crisis was created and is being escalated by one side unilaterally, by the Russian Federation.
Well, here Boris Johnson's pledging further sanctions and military support to help Ukraine defend itself. But will it be enough? Also tonight, social housing conditions are condemned by the Housing Secretary himself. Michael Gove tells ITV News the government has failed tenants. The latest on the floods, with the waters still rising and threatening parts of the country. And
I've always wanted a Geordie accent.
How the lost voice guy finally sounds the way he wants.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale.
Good evening. Britain today pledged to send more weapons and other military aid to Ukraine to help the country defend itself against what the Prime Minister's calling Russia's increasingly threatening behaviour. In Ukraine itself, that threat seems to grow by the hour. Ukraine's government says it intends to impose a state of emergency and is preparing to call up reserve forces. Today, Ukrainian government websites crashed after warnings of Russian cyber attacks. Meanwhile, Russia itself, which has begun evacuating its embassy in Kiev, has been celebrating its Defender of the Fatherland Day with patriotic ceremonies and a militaristic video. From Kiev, our Europe editor James Mates reports.
In the trenches on Ukraine's front line, living under a state of emergency is routine. For the rest of the country, today's new rules are a worrying sign that Russia's moves this week may just be a prelude to something much worse. A short way across the so-called line of contact, armoured vehicles from Russia certainly point in that direction, as do reports of cyber attacks against Ukraine's government and vital infrastructure this evening. In Moscow, President Putin was laying a wreath at the tomb of Russia's unknown soldier, respecting his country's war dead at the very moment he may be poised to order more young men and women to their deaths. In a televised address, he said he was still open to talk, though in the same breath appeared to rule out talking about anything meaningful. Our country is always open for direct and honest dialogue, he said, for finding diplomatic solutions. But I repeat, Russia's interests and the security of our citizens are not negotiable. In the absence of diplomacy, Ukraine's foreign minister took his plea for action and support direct to the UN General Assembly in New York.
There is no more important task today than to not repeat the mistakes of the past. I do believe in the power of the free world and our joint ability to avert a new devastating catastrophe in Europe that no nation will be able to sit out.
Back in Kiev, his president was getting support from the presidents of Poland and Lithuania, two near neighbours who also find themselves much too close for comfort to Putin's tank formations. They value the protection full membership of Western clubs has given them.
If you weren't in NATO now, how likely do you think it will be that you would be the targets of the same pressure Ukraine?
We would be in very similar position as Ukraine now. So we are lucky to be the member of NATO and European Union.
And the response yesterday, has the UK done enough?
Yes, someone could ask, maybe we could do more, but I think it's always useful to have a little bit in the pocket for the future.
That's a more diplomatic take than many here who believe the UK has talked a good game on sanctions but not delivered very much. The real test, though, will be the response if Putin were to make another move. James Mates, ITV News, Kiev.
Well, for now, the flashpoint remains. The separatists held areas of eastern Ukraine. The border between Ukrainian territory and the two areas controlled by Russian separatists is bitterly contested. Our correspondent Dan Rivers is in Bakhmut, close to the border with the rebel region. Dan, is there an increase in nervousness there today?
I don't think there really is, to be honest. We're only about 15 miles from the line of contact, but the people in this town have got used to living with a war on their doorstep for the last 8 years. We had a good walk around the town today. Life goes on as normal. The shops and cafes are open. There was a band playing in the centre of the town earlier on today, so absolutely no sign that they're sort of panicking and boarding up windows or anything. However, we have seen an increased presence of the Ukrainian military, armoured personnel carriers doing the rounds on patrol here, which we haven't seen before. We've also travelled a few miles out of this town, right up to the line of contact, and there houses that haven't been touched by fighting, blocks of flats that haven't been touched by fighting in the last few years are now being targeted by Russian-backed separatists with artillery and rockets. Of course, there is another warning from US intelligence that tonight perhaps an invasion is less than 48 hours away. Perhaps the northern city of Kharkiv might be one of the first targets, but we've heard these warnings before, and each time nothing has resulted the next day.
Dan Rivers for the moment in Ukraine. Thank you. Well, here, Boris Johnson was forced to defend his sanctions against Russia today, responding to MPs who claimed the measures are not strong enough. He said he would bring in tougher ones if necessary. Meanwhile, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace was caught making unguarded comments about Vladimir Putin, going, as he put it, full tonto over Ukraine. Here's our political reporter, Shihab Khan.
These are the handful of banks and oligarchs who have been targeted by sanctions so far. Part of Putin's inner circle, they are the first. But the question now is when will more follow?
Are you going to toughen up sanctions, Prime Minister?
Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's Questions today was asked exactly that, as he was criticised for the limited nature of the sanctions so far.
We're not dealing with breakaway republics. Putin is not a peacekeeper. A sovereign nation has been invaded. The Prime Minister promised that in the event of an invasion, he would unleash a full package of sanctions. If not now, then when?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is more to come, but it is absolutely vital that after this first barrage, we work in lockstep with friends and allies around the world. And we squeeze him simultaneously. We squeeze him simultaneously in London, in Paris, in New York at the same time.
There was also a promise about a further package of military support for the Ukrainian government. But in contrast to the Commons, an unguarded Defence Secretary described Putin's decisions as crazy.
Gone full tonto. So the Scots Guards kicked the backside of Tsar Nicholas I in 1853 in Crimea. We can always do it again.
There have also been calls for Russian state-backed TV station RT to be banned in the UK, and the government has now asked the regulator Ofcom to review their broadcasts. There are other steps that may also follow. We could see further sanctions against other oligarchs, as well as Russian businesses based in Britain. Russia could also be excluded from the global payment system SWIFT. That would make it hard for their banks to do business and make it difficult for the Russian government to raise finances. There could also be refusals to buy Russia's oil and gas, but that could have an impact on our economy here.
The conflict is going to affect prices that they're going to see at the supermarket, at the pump. We would expect that food prices are going to increase, one, because transportation cost is going to be higher, and second, a big chunk of essentially the goods that are consumed in the UK are also imported.
The extent of further sanctions will depend on Russia's decisions and if they choose to escalate the crisis in Ukraine any further. Shihab Khan, ITV News, Westminster.
Let's move on to other news now. And the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, has told ITV News he is ashamed of the living conditions exposed by our investigation into Britain's social housing. He also admitted the government has failed to carry out its promises in the wake of the Grenfell disaster over 4 years ago. Mr Gove was speaking exclusively to our correspondent, Daniel Hewitt.
It is almost impossible to believe people live like this in Britain today. But the squalid state of this housing association tenant's bathroom, where children have to wash, surrounded in thick black mould.
When it rains, it gets really bad.
And sewage that pours into this council tenant's bathroom day after day show this scandal is all too real.
Because water was here, into coming here.
They both complained to their landlords for months before anything was done, and happened on the watch of Housing Secretary Michael Gove. We showed him some of the conditions we found.
Do you feel ashamed that people in this country are having to live like that?
Yes. Your work and others have highlighted a situation which we promised to fix 4 years ago and which we haven't. The Grenfell tragedy was a tragedy of many dimensions. One of the things that everyone pledged to do afterwards was to make sure that people in social housing had their voices heard. And we haven't done that effectively.
We are at this point, aren't we? Because we have a regulator of social housing that can't visit people's homes and can't speak to tenants when they complain, yet they can speak to the landlord. Your government put that regulator in place. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
Well, it's certainly the case that we're going to change the way in which the regulator operates. That's the whole point of the
but why was it ever set up in that way, that you have a regulator that can't speak to tenants but it can speak to landlords?
Well, I asked myself that question, and I don't know why that mistake was made. You know, one of the striking things...
Your government?
Yeah.
2011.
What we should do is learn and pledge to do better.
We just simply haven't built enough homes.
Yes, I think that's right.
And there are 1.1 million families in England alone on the social housing waiting list. In this country last year, fewer than 6,000 social homes were built in Britain. By any measurement, that is a failure, isn't it?
It's nowhere near enough. No, we've got to do better. Again, I don't want to criticise my predecessors because they were operating under constraints, but the Chancellor's made available a significant amount of money, more than £11 billion, in order to increase the number of affordable homes.
Reforms the government promised after Grenfell to give tenants more rights, to give the regulator more power to step in, will be brought into law in May or June, he said. But Michael Gove is the 5th Housing Secretary in 6 years, the latest to make promises to tenants forced to live in damage and disrepair, but ignored. Repairing trust is perhaps his biggest challenge. Daniel Hewitt, ITV News.
A rapist who attacked 2 women in Leeds has been jailed for life after shocking CCTV images, which we're about to show you, pictured him carrying one of his victims through the streets. Austin Osiyande grabbed the woman as she was trying to get a taxi home in 2015 and then attacked her in a doorway. Osiyande was only caught 6 years later after sexually assaulting another woman. Now, residents in communities along rivers swollen by heavy rain after the recent storms are anxiously eyeing their flood defences tonight. 2 severe flood warnings indicating a danger to life remain in place. One is at Ironbridge in Shropshire, where last night the River Severn came within a few centimetres of breaching flood barriers. And the other is at Bewdley in Worcestershire, a town still waiting for the permanent barriers it was promised 2 years ago. From there, Ben Chapman reports.
By the Severn in Bewdley, river water is once again on the wrong side of the blue flood barriers. Residents, exhausted after spending all night keeping the water from the door, are also weary of the sense of the inevitable. The 3rd time in 3 years their temporary defences have failed to protect them.
It's a nightmare and it shouldn't be happening like this again.
Irene is speaking to me on the phone because floodwaters have cut off her house. She's living upstairs while trying to pump water out of the downstairs. All the more frustrating because houses sitting behind permanent defences on the other side of the river remain dry.
What I do feel really mad about, and that gets me angry, when they did the other side, we were just left. They should have done both sides at the same time.
These defences which were overtopped, weren't they?
2 years ago, Boris Johnson promised new permanent defences on a visit here, but they won't be completed for another 2 years.
Can you keep expecting these communities to just keep putting up with it until then?
What we've got here is the only thing that can be offered as a temporary structure. This defence has protected in the past and kept them dry in the past. It's just simply when you get 3 or 4 named storms in a row, you get huge river levels.
We finished all the repairs and the alterations from the flood 2 years ago last Tuesday.
For residents like David, it means living in constant fear of ever more frequent storms.
We don't want to see people flooded out of their homes. Some of my neighbours haven't moved back into their houses from the flood 2 years ago yet. The building works aren't complete. So I think there are lots of things that could be better.
In this town of two halves, dry on the right, drowned on the left, the change in our weather has outpaced our ability to build new defences. It is a challenge being faced by communities the length of this river. One of those places is Worcester, downstream from here. The river level is peaking round about now, and we know that some homes are flooded there too. Now, the Environment Agency says the situation on this river is gradually improving now, but with it so full, the threat of flooding will return with any more significant rain.
All right, Ben Chapman in Bewdley, thank you. Still to come on the ITV Evening News, the university shake-up that critics are warning will hit poorest students the hardest. And the tennis star made to feel unsafe in her own home. Emma Raducanu's stalker is sentenced. Those stories and more after the break. Join me then. Hello and welcome back. Now, plans which could link student loans to passing maths and English GCSE came under fire today. The government's expected to publish its review of higher education funding later this week. But critics say any measures to block loans for pupils who fail maths and English could prevent many poorer children from going to university at all. Sergio Caria reports.
GCSE maths and English could become must-pass subjects in the future, or there'll be no university student loan under new government plans. But for many students, the proposals simply don't add up, and they're marking them down as a fail.
Personally, we wouldn't be able to afford going to uni through the amount that my parents earn. So the fact that if I don't get the grades and I wouldn't be able to actually fully go to uni is honestly so much pressure.
There are already people like my friends who are predicted to get a grade 5, maybe lower, and this already discourages them even further.
I don't think it's helpful at all. And as I say, there are ways to put stepping stones in place for children to achieve, and you're looking for positive stepping stones for them to achieve, not putting barriers in their way.
In the biggest shake-up of higher education funding in a decade, these plans would mean pupils who fail to get a grade 4, the equivalent of a C, in GCSE English and Maths or 2 E's at A-level, would be barred from receiving a student loan. Latest figures show 29%, or a third of 19-year-olds, didn't pass their English and Maths at GCSE.
Is it right at the moment that the system pushes forward students who are not ready, who have 3 E's at A-level, into university? Or is it better if we ensure that they're really prepared for university and in a position that they're ready for it?
Hannah Walton failed her GCSE maths first time and she never took A-levels. Nevertheless, she's now studying for a master's degree at Manchester University, something she'd never be able to do under these proposals.
So if I was going through the system as the new students coming up are, I would feel extremely disheartened if I wasn't in the situation that I am now as a master's student. Then I'm not entirely sure what I'd be doing.
But universities are calling the plans madness, saying they limit opportunity for students from disadvantaged backgrounds when it should be expanded. Sergio Caria, ITV News.
A bit of sad news tonight. Anna Karen, star of the hit ITV sitcom On the Buses, has died aged 85 in a house fire in East London. Karen played Olive Rudge in the show from 69 to 72. The actress was also known for her role as Aunt Sal in EastEnders. Sir Elton John's private jet was forced to make an emergency landing earlier today. The plane twice aborted at Farnborough Airport in Hampshire, but he safely took a later flight. And the Duchess of Cambridge was welcomed by Denmark's Queen and Crown Princess at the Royal Palace there today. It was part of Kate's 2-day visit to Denmark. Now, a court heard today how a stalker walked more than 20 miles to appear at the home of the tennis star Emma Raducanu. As well as leaving notes and flowers, Amrit Meghar even put Christmas decorations in her front garden. He was given a 5-year restraining order, as Garrett Vincent reports.
Emma Raducanu has become one of the biggest stars in world sport, and last night she was competing in Mexico before a hip injury brought her tournament to an early end. In her hometown this morning, a judge tried to bring a frightening chapter in her life off court to a close. This man, Amrit Magar, was found guilty last month of stalking Raducanu. He'd found out where she lived and left flowers and a note at her family home which read, "Nothing to say, but you deserve love." On another occasion, a map which sketched out the route from his house to hers, 23 miles, which he said he had walked. And on his last visit, he was captured on the doorbell camera before taking a training shoe from the porch as a souvenir. In a written statement to the court, Emma Raducanu described how Magar's behaviour had left her feeling that she wasn't safe in her own home, apprehensive about going out and constantly looking over her shoulder. A stalker walked out of court having been given a 5-year restraining order and 200 hours of community service.
A restraining order has been issued, and that is a positive thing, but we would really like to see restraining orders being issued indefinitely, so not having a cap on that time limit. Although, of course, it is positive that we have that conviction at all. We know that in many, many cases of stalking, there is no conviction, and so we can't take away from that positive outcome.
Magar will spend the next 8 weeks under curfew, monitored by an electronic tag. The Raducanu family, meanwhile, are improving security measures at their home and considering moving house. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
And finally, to a very special moment for the comedian Lee Ridley today, known as the Lost Voice Guy and discovered by Britain's Got Talent. He can normally only talk through an automated machine, which now uses his native Geordie accent, as Hannah Miller reports.
When I realised I'd never be able to talk again, I was speechless.
Lee Ridley rose to fame as the winner of Britain's Got Talent.
I have lived in Newcastle all my life. Yes! But for some reason, I still haven't picked up the accent.
That was until today.
Thanks for your voice anyway.
No worries.
When Lee was reunited with the man who recorded his voice for Lee to use.
I've always wanted a Geordie accent. I don't think my previous voice represented where I came from. There was nothing wrong with my other voice, except from the fact that it sounded very posh. It means a lot to me to finally be able to sound like my family and friends.
I'm also known as the Lost Voice Guy.
Lee has cerebral palsy and has used a communication device since he was 8 years old.
There's plenty of things that you can put in there that I definitely wouldn't.
Dan was chosen from hundreds of applicants after a search to find the perfect voice.
What's it like for you hearing Lee using your voice?
Not as strange as you might think, actually. It's quite nice to think that he can go and communicate with an accent from a place where he's from, and that is super important.
Does it still seem weird to you? Is it going to take a lot of getting used to?
It's still really weird, but in a good way. I think my family will take some time to get used to it too. They'll probably wonder who the random Geordie bloke is.
Lost Voice Guy! But for a comedian whose act is still instantly recognisable, finding his Geordie voice is another moment to celebrate. Hannah Miller, ITV News, Newcastle.
He's found his voice properly, hasn't he? That's it. Nina's here with news at 10 from me and all the team. Bye-bye.